Rangers, welcome to class. So today we are going to continue in our unit on Revolutionary Georgia. So first, a brief review to kind of go over what we talked about yesterday in class. We went over the end of the French and Indian War, and we discussed the proclamation of 1763. Quick review, who can tell me what the proclamation line of 1763 was? We learned it yesterday. Yeah, Matt.
It was an act that the British put on the colonists that said they could not go past a certain line of settlement.
Okay, yeah, so they couldn't go which direction?
West.
They couldn't go further west than a certain line. It was right down the Appalachian Mountains. We also talked about yesterday, why did this make the colonists upset? Josh?
Just because it hindered their opportunities to get new land.
Right. We talked about how the colonies were growing yesterday. They needed space to expand. They fought this French and Indian War so that they could move further west. And then we're very angered by the proclamation of 1763. We also talked about the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress yesterday. Quick review, did Georgia send any delegates to the Stamp Act Congress? No, they did not. And then finally we discussed the effects of the Townshend Acts and how Georgia began importing goods from other trading partners. So throughout this time period, national events continued to affect Georgia, which is what we will focus on today. So for your warm-up activity, I've given you all a Venn diagram. Please wait until I finish explaining the instructions before you start with the activity. What we're going to do is look at these two images depicting the Boston Massacre. You're going to use your Venn diagrams that I've given you to compare the two images and discuss the differences in how they're drawn. How are the British drawn? How are the colonists drawn? Looking at these accounts, who started the conflict? So those questions right there are sort of guide questions to give you ideas as you finish, or as you fill out your Venn diagram. But anything you notice, any differences can be filled out on there, any similarities can be filled out on there. So I'll go ahead and give you all 4 minutes to complete this activity. So, like I said, anything at all that you notice about these pictures, color, dimension, can go in your Venn diagram. Please make sure you have something filled in all 3 spaces on your Venn diagram, at least 2 things in each space, but you all still have plenty of time. So if you don't have at least 2 observations in each section, make sure that you go ahead and get those written down. Okay, time is up. So everyone go ahead and put down your pencils. And by a show of hands, can someone raise their hand and tell me something that they observed about the image on the left-hand side, this one right here? Rachel.
There's a random dog.
There is a random dog. We don't know why that dog is there or what he's doing, but there does appear to be canine involvement. Who else? Matt.
The British are in ranks and are being ordered to fire.
Okay, yeah, look, you can see this gentleman behind, looks like he's shouting at them to fire. They're in a straight line. Very good. Anybody notice anything else about the image on the left? Josh?
Some of the colonists almost look like their hands they look really innocent.
Right, yeah, so they look like, no, please don't fire. They don't look like they're doing anything wrong. Mike?
It's all neat and orderly. 2 lines, and there's a nice space between them.
Right, okay. Now, what about some observations about this image on the right? Matt?
There's just general chaos for everybody involved.
Right, yeah, it looks chaotic. So we discussed in the image on the left, the colonists don't look like they're doing anything wrong. What about this image?
It looks like an angry mob.
Right, it looks like an angry mob, okay? You see them holding things. What about the British in this image on the right-hand side? What do the British look like, Matt?
They're in a very defensive position, being surrounded by the colonists.
Okay, great, yeah, so they're feeling very defensive in this picture, whereas in the picture on the left, they're very organized. They're in rows. They look like they could have been marching. Josh, what did you find?
I found it very interesting. It looks like there's actually maybe 1 or 2 or 3 colonists on the right, and one of them, that guy is dead, actually looks like a colonist to me too, which is indicating the British, they might be saying the British might be trying to actually protect some of the other colonists.
Okay, yeah, very cool. Now, similarities. Did anybody find similarities between the two? Matt?
In both of them, you can see the bodies of colonists who were killed scattered around the ground.
Okay, yeah, in both of them there appear to be bodies on the ground. Rachel?
The place that they're in, they look like they're in a town square.
Right, the place is very similar for both of them. So this image on the left-hand side is an engraving that was actually made by Paul Revere. What do we know Paul Revere for?
British are coming.
Right, the British are coming. We're going to talk about Paul Revere a little bit later in this lesson. So the image on the left-hand side was created by Paul Revere immediately following the Boston Massacre. The image on the right-hand side was a painting done by Alonzo Chappell in the mid-1800s, so almost a full century later. So in this unit today, we're going to learn about the Boston Massacre. We're going to learn about these events leading towards independence, but we're also going to learn about historical sources. We're going to talk about primary sources. We're going to talk about reliability and how people can have different accounts of the same event. So does anybody remember the fight that happened last week? Does anybody remember that? Middle school happened last week. Did everybody have the same story about what happened?
No.
Right, there were a bunch of different accounts. If you and your friend even went to the same event, are you both going to have the same story, or will they be slightly different? So what we're going to do later today is look at different accounts and try to determine which accounts are reliable and which aren't. So moving on, before we start talking about the Boston Massacre, I just want to make sure, as always, when we're taking our notes, that you pay special attention to the key terms, which are going to be italicized and underlined. So before we talk specifically about the Boston Massacre, I kind of want to give you an image of the situation leading up to it. So many British soldiers who were stationed in Boston had begun to seek part-time work to earn a little bit of extra money. That's all good and well, but this upset the colonists greatly because the British soldiers were willing to work for a little less. They had their army paid to fall back on, so the colonists, who had typically worked these jobs, were now earning less money, and fights began to break out throughout Boston. On this particular evening, March 5th, 1770, a British guard stood protecting the customs house. The customs house was filled with silver, filled with money collected from taxes, and a rowdy crowd of young men approached the customs house. They were jeering at the guard, they were taunting him, making fun of him. They began to throw snowballs and chunks of ice. The guard drew his musket and the angry mob dared him to fire. He did not fire at the colonists, instead he called for reinforcements. Captain Preston brought reinforcements, and even with Captain Prescott and the reinforced men, the crowd wouldn't break up. They ordered the mob to disperse, to break up, and the mob continued to yell at the British soldiers. Fire, they dared them to fire. This is where the story gets a little bit tricky. The things that we do know that happened: a musket went off, which prompted other British soldiers to fire. And when all was said and done, American colonists were killed. While there were varying accounts, all of the accounts do agree on that, those two basic facts. So this image that we looked at in our warm-up, what does this show? Does this show an angry mob? No, doesn't show an angry mob. We also learned that 5 people were killed. 5 people, would we consider that a massacre?
Not so much.
Maybe. So Paul Revere, we discussed, we know about him, the British are coming. We also know that Paul Revere was an influential member of the Sons of Liberty and a skilled silversmith. So this engraving is a wonderful example of propaganda, which is one of our vocab terms for this unit. Rachel, can you read the definition of propaganda to the class?
Material designed to influence opinion.
Okay, great. So propaganda is material designed to influence opinion. So in the case of this engraving, what is Paul Revere trying to get the colonists to feel? Does he want them to be happy towards the British? No, he's trying to incite anger. He's trying to outrage the colonists. Which, going back to this past picture, drawn almost a century later, painted almost a century later, could maybe be considered a little bit more accurate depiction of what happened. So colonists were furious, learning this Boston Massacre, British soldiers fired on innocent Americans who weren't doing anything wrong. Georgians were also furious. Governor Wright, the royal governor of Georgia, urged Georgians to remain loyal despite the events in Boston. And then shortly following the Boston Massacre in 1771, the new Commons House, which is Georgia's legislative branch, met and chose Noble W. Jones as the speaker. However, Jones was rejected by Governor Wright because he had spoke out so strongly against the British. Governor Wright, who was attempting to remain loyal to the British, did not think that Noble W. Jones was suitable to be speaker. After rejecting Noble Jones, Archibald Bullock was elected. Now, Archibald Bullock had also spoken out against the British, yet he had done so a little bit more tactfully. He was a little more gentle about the way he did so. Governor Wright believed that English laws should be obeyed regardless of the events in Massachusetts, and that negotiations should occur with British Parliament. Because of this, Georgia's legislative body and the governor disagreed regularly. And this is a recurring theme that we're going to see this whole year as we learn about national and state history. Who can tell me who the current Speaker of the House is for the United States? Mike.
Boehner?
Right, John Boehner. Now, do John Boehner and the leader of the executive branch, the president, do they get along often? No, right? So this is a recurring theme that we're going to see throughout this year. So a few years after the Boston Massacre, the colonists had settled down a little bit. Yesterday we learned about the Townshend Acts, about how upset the colonists were over the Townshend Acts, how they revolted against these acts. So what Parliament did, they decided to repeal the acts because there was more trouble than it was worth. But they wound up repealing all acts except for the Tea Act. They left the Tea Act in place to prove to the colonists that Britain still had the authority to tax them. Here's the thing about the Tea Act. It did not make tea more expensive. What it did do was establish a monopoly on tea. Josh, can you read the definition of monopoly for the class?
Yes. Only one business providing a good or service.
Right, so a monopoly means that only one business is providing a good or service. In this case, it was the British East India Company. The Tea Act made it so the British East India Company was the only tea that could be sold. It prohibited the Dutch tea that had been smuggled in before. So again, the colonists were outraged, they were very upset, and Samuel Adams urged committees of correspondence to spread news from town to town in the colonies. All right, so let's think back, several hundred years ago. You're really upset about something, everybody's mad about something. How are you gonna spread the word? You gonna text your friends? Can you post something on Facebook? Post a tweet, send out an email? Mike, how would you spread the word?
Newsprint.
Newsprint, okay, yeah, great. Letters, maybe. Everything has to be printed and delivered places. There's no, there's US Post, but it's much slower even than the slow US Post that we know today. So the committees of correspondence were groups of like-minded individuals who spread information regarding the threat faced by all colonies. They wanted to promote collective action. The committees of correspondence were a means of propaganda. We learned influencing opinion. They did want to influence opinion. They wanted to incite anger amongst the colonists, but it was also a means of debate. Committees of correspondence rose up over certain issues, then spread to broader issues, ultimately promoting revolution. So the Tea Act, everyone was furious. The Sons of Liberty, which we introduced yesterday, the Sons of Liberty we're going to see throughout this whole time period leading up to the Revolution. They kind of go dormant in between these various tax acts, but they always reappear when there's something to be outraged about with Britain. So the Sons of Liberty organized a boycott of the British tea. After organizing the boycott, the British soldiers demanded that the tea be unloaded onto the docks, so the Sons of Liberty wound up boarding the ships dressed as Indians. They weren't met with any resistance by the captains of the ships, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, which was worth 10,000 British pounds. Today, that's worth about $1.7 million. It's a lot of tea. There were also smaller protests that occurred elsewhere. In Charleston, South Carolina, they unloaded the tea onto the dock and would not move the tea off the dock. However, here in Georgia, no tea was shipped to Savannah, the main port of Georgia, so no protests occurred here in the state of Georgia. Following the Boston Tea Party, King George was furious with the colonists. He wanted to punish them for what happened, specifically Boston and Massachusetts, which he saw as the center of the rebellion. So to punish the colonies, Parliament passed a series of acts called the Coercive Acts, or known today as the Intolerable Acts. So the Coercive Acts did several things, first of which they closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. Only essential goods could travel into Boston Harbor. No luxuries, no books, no magazines. Basic clothes and food was about all the colonists were getting in Boston. The Coercive Acts outlawed the Sons of Liberty and committees of correspondence. Only one town meeting could occur per year. Groups could not meet in the street. They could not stand and discuss. The Quartering Act was something also that infuriated the colonists. It required colonists to feed and shelter British troops in their home. So as we're discussing this, we're thinking about this time. Do you think the colonists were very happy about British troops being there? No. Would you want to have a soldier in your home who you didn't even want in your town?
No.
No, right. So this made them really upset. And finally, British officials accused of crime would stand trial in England. And this also upset the colonists because that sent the message to the colonists that they weren't capable of holding fair trials in America. General Thomas Gage was appointed the governor of Massachusetts, creating sort of a military state. Word quickly spread about what happened in Boston, despite committees of correspondence being prohibited. They found a way. And representative committees called for a meeting of colonial representatives to discuss how they should respond. Which brings us to the First Continental Congress. Colonists had to devise a plan about what to do about the severe encroachment of their rights. So representatives from all colonies, except for Georgia and Florida, met in Pennsylvania in September of 1774. They passed the Declaration of Resolves. This was a huge step in the movement to independence. The Declaration of Resolves did two main things: boycotted all trade with Britain until the repeal of the Intolerable Acts, and it advised colonists to arm themselves and form militias. While the colonies were not ready to officially declare independence from England, this is the first time that they're insisting on colonial rights. They agreed to meet again in May if Parliament did not repeal the acts. So Georgia was also furious about the Tea Act. Georgia was upset, but as the youngest colony, Georgia was more dependent on Great Britain. They didn't have as many resources to be willing to break away from Great Britain. However, there were vocal patriots in Georgia at this time. Before the Continental Congress met, Georgians met at Peter Tondy's Tavern in Savannah. It was a small group that met to discuss issues facing the colonies. However, the main objective of Georgia at this time was to keep good relations with British troops who protected them from Native Americans. Again, we mentioned Georgia's the youngest colony. That means there's a lot more Native Americans, a lot more conflict. So the British troops were kind of crucial at this point in Georgia. They met again later that summer and called themselves the Committee of 30. And at that meeting, all parishes voted and objected to the Intolerable Acts. Lyman Hall, who we're going to learn about later this week, was strongly in favor of attending the Continental Congress. However, Elijah Clark, William Few, and George Wells opposed, believed that we could still cooperate with Britain. So back up north, tensions continued to grow in Boston, and General Gage, who was the royal governor, learned of a storehouse of weapons and ammunition west of Boston and sent troops to destroy the supplies and to capture two key leaders of the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams and John Hancock. So Paul Revere and William Dawes learned of the plan of the British troops and rode to warn citizens, taking different routes to reach the largest amount of citizens possible. A British patrol stopped Revere and Dawes. However, the word was carried on to Concord, and in the morning of April 19, 1775, when the British troops marched into Lexington, they were met by a group of colonial militiamen. So I'm going to show a quick clip of this video. That kind of reinforces what we just talked about.
Regulars are coming, sir, now.
Send for Dawes and Revere.
Both men, sir.
We'll send one by land and one by sea.
But the regulars are coming by sea, sir.
If there were other routes, we would take them too. one will and one will make it.
So notice how they're not saying the British are coming, they're saying the regulars or the redcoats. They would not have actually called the British British because they considered themselves British at the time. That's a kind of a myth we learned.
Did they
He wasn't even called Britain at that point?
Yeah, they would have considered themselves British or English, but
Reveal. What route of Riggle is taking? By your path, all by sea, and 2 lanterns. And if I do not make the passage, the light will. Charlestown will not be caught sleeping. We need more than Charlestown. And we shall have it. I need Lockett's horse. What are they doing? They plan to take Messrs. Hancock and Adams to Lexington and to destroy our weapons in Concord. And we're sending 700 armed men to do it as we sleep. They mean to crush us.
We'll be lost.
Not even the king can make 700 men march as fast as a single man can ride.
I found you. I'm headed to Lexington.
Immediately.
I just came from there. I passed 10 English soldiers along the way.
Is it too late?
They won't move until they're all together. These are guards.
Maybe we should talk to them again.
Why? Because they've ignored our every plea? Or should we wait until they've destroyed our only hope of resistance? See if that sweetens their tempers.
I don't know that anyone would be able to pass the road to Lexington tonight.
Another rider was sent by the other route, over the Boston Neck.
Sir, your horse is ready.
this is my favorite part of the film, the dramatic horse riding montage.
Seems so majestic.
The Redcoats are coming! The Redcoats are coming! Wake up your men and bring them to Lexington at once! Wake up! The regulars are coming! Wake up and be a free man or nobody dies tonight! Redcoats are coming! The Redcoats are coming!
What's that racket? What assassins come in the middle of the night?
Regulars.
Look at the gun.
All right, so that is where we will stop.